Forget everything you know about a thieves' guild or the order of the generic knights as static entries in a role-playing sourcebook. Most world builders treat factions like furniture. They're just there, unchanging until the plot demands a quest where they're involved. But true power is never static. It is a living, breathing organism that follows the same brutal laws of evolution as a population fighting for survival. And today, I'll walk you through the energy stability area model of population ecology alongside the historical iron law of oligarchy to create factions that have deep lore and that feel alive to your readers and players alike, even if these factions are just bit players of your story. Welcome to Worldbuilding Blueprints Season 2, Episode 8, Factions of a City. Before we apply the high-level evolution of the ESA model or the ticking clock of the life cycle of a faction, we have to build the body of the faction. In world building, a faction is way more than just a name. It's a whole subculture, a specialized ecosystem that survives within the larger climate of your city. To make a faction feel real in this context, you need to define 3 pillars of information. The first pillar is that of purpose and ideology. Every faction is a solution to a problem, whether it's protection of pilgrims, or making a living outside of the law, or quality control of smithed goods. Factions exist because the city's mainstream culture left a gap. That gap is your faction's starting reason for existence. Their ideology defines how they fill that gap. So for this pillar, consider both what your culture does and how they do it, and that gives you your purpose and your ideology for your faction. Also remember, a faction exists within a culture. So does their ideology match the city's cultural ideologies, as in it is a mainstream faction of the culture, or is it a deliberate rejection of the mainstream culture and thus it is a countercultural faction? A merchant guild, for example, might mirror the king's laws, but a shadowy thieves guild might operate on a brutal meritocracy because they think inherited positions are weak. Our second pillar is the faction's hierarchy and status. This defines how power flows in your faction. Bear in mind that not every group is a pyramid. You might have a military model for your faction where the hierarchy is top-down and orders are absolute. Or you might have a classic guild model with a 3-tier system of apprentice, journeyman, and master, which gatekeeps knowledge. Or you might go completely flat with your faction, like a cell-based revolutionary group where no one knows who the big boss is. And before you say that's not a valid model, consider the Linux open source community. Anyone can participate if they have the skills, and there is no explicit management class, although the code owners, Linus Torvalds first among them, do gatekeep merging into the master branch of the core. So a faction doesn't have to have a hierarchy, although most do tend toward it. The third pillar of a faction is identity and branding. This is how the world recognizes your faction and how they recognize each other. Here, you should think about symbols like tattoos, insignias, or even a specific color and make of a cloak. And don't forget about a faction's internal jargon and slang. When a thief says, "the watch is whistling," it means something different than a baker saying it. Also, what would a faction be without oaths and handshakes and initiation rites? More than flavor, these are loyalty tests, especially if they are high cost. I discussed this in Worldbuilding Blueprints Volume 1, but it's worth repeating here. One of the most powerful tools in building group identity is the concept of high-cost bonding actions through initiation and rituals. When individuals must sacrifice something meaningful to belong, be it time, effort, pain, or status, they tend to value that belonging more. The investment becomes emotional and psychological. Consider the galley priests of the Sibylline cult of Rome. They removed certain manly parts from themselves during an ecstatic ritual on the 24th of March each year. After doing something like that to join a faction, there's no way you're leaving. So, that gives us the main body of your faction, who they are as a group. But I want to return to that concept of the gap society leaves and why factions come to exist in the first place. So to really delve into the why behind why some factions fail and some succeed and why they exist at all, we need to understand the Energy Stability Area or ESA model as adapted from Population Biology by Virginia Gray and David Lowry in their fantastic book, The Population Ecology of Interest Representation. Wait, don't let your eyes glaze over. I promise I'll simplify and make it fantasy. Under the ESA model, factions do not operate in a vacuum. Instead, they exist within a population ecology where their density and diversity are constrained by environmental forces. In this framework, area refers to the resources and latent constituencies, the potential recruits, available for organizations, while energy represents the intensity of motivation among these potential recruits, and stability denotes the durability of the surrounding political system. So, to adapt this to a fantasy world and factions, if you have 1,000 beggars in a city, that's 1,000 potential recruits for a thieves' guild, or the area available to the potential guild. The energy of these recruits are determined by how bad conditions are in the city, and if they can survive by panhandling, or if they need to upgrade to direct crime. If, for example, the Church of Charity regularly feeds beggars, the energy to turn to crime isn't that high. If, on the other hand, begging gets you tossed into stocks, the temptation to crime becomes higher because you're already punished for begging. Might as well go the whole hog. Finally, stability refers to the legal and political sturdiness of the existing factions in the city, as in how much resistance is there to the new faction. High stability would be, for example, when the city watch is well paid, the laws are clear, and the dungeons are scary. It's very hard for a new faction of thieves to break that surface. Low stability, on the other hand, might be the city watch is on strike, the prince is an infant, the nobles are feuding, and the previous thieves' guild has fallen apart because the leader is dead. Lots of opportunities exist for new factions to form in such an environment. The other principle we need to understand is density dependence. This predicts that as the density of factions in a particular niche rises, the founding rate of new organizations eventually decrease due to the depletion of resources. This sounds more complicated than it is. Basically, it just means that there's only so many people available to form a faction. And if one thieves' guild sweeps up all the beggars, the other thieves' guild loses out. Multiple thieves' guilds or factions within a niche also tend to compete with each other, as predicted by ecology's theory competitive exclusion principle, which says that if two factions exist in the same niche, one will tend to outcompete the other for limited resources. This principle is pretty central to the founding and rising phases of my faction lifecycle model, where survival depends on a faction's ability to either dominate each niche or engage in resource partitioning, which is to say, the faction evolves to occupy a distinct ideological or social role to minimize direct competition. Essentially, one faction of potential thieves' guilds chooses to specialize in fencing stolen items to avoid direct competition with a bigger guild that's already swept up all the beggars in the city. Okay, so this explains the why behind faction. But I promised you a life cycle model, and all I've given you is founding and rising through competition. Before we get into ascended and declining factions, give me one moment to tell you how you can get even more out of this podcast. Members of the Just in Time Worldbuilding YouTube channel get free access to the worksheets that accompany each episode of this podcast. From the Build It in Straw tier to the Build It in Stone tier, not only do you get these worksheets, but you also get a monthly members live stream and early access to all my videos. And if you don't want to commit to monthly memberships, you can also purchase these worksheets on my Ko-fi page. If you're interested in the first season's worksheets, buy the book Worldbuilding Blueprints Volume 1, which is an epic book with full color layout and worksheets that will guide you from zero to hero. The digital format of the book is available on my website right now, and the physical will follow in late April 2026. The first 30 people who use the code CITY2026 will get 30% off purchasing any digital copy of the book. So that is an audiobook, an EPUB, or PDF from my website. Links to all that down below. Now, let's discuss the ascendant, declining, and reform of factions. Beyond the ESA model, there is another important sociological law to understand, the iron law of oligarchy, as formulated by Robert Michels. This thesis contends that all complex organizations eventually succumb to rule by an elite few. The needs of specialized knowledge, centralized authority, and the division of tasks lead to the rise of a professional leadership class whose primary objective shifts from the organization's original goals to the preservation of the institution and their own status within the organization. To go back to our imaginary thieves guild, they might start off as an organization that's just trying to feed the kids by stealing from the rich. But they have to organize in order to avoid the watch. A charismatic leader arises and is really good at organizing the beggars. They avoid the watch, they steal from the fat merchants, they feed the kids, and all is well. But then a challenger comes along and says that the fat merchants are growing lean, and the guild should shift to offering protection to inns in order to feed the kids. The leader doesn't like this challenge to his authority and crushes the idea and the challenger. Now, the guild is no longer about the ideals of feeding the kids. It's about keeping the leader in power. This is obviously a super simplified example, but it shows how the iron law of oligarchy drives the faction into stagnation, even if it is an ascended faction or a faction that holds power. But stagnation of a faction doesn't have to be the end. A stagnant faction might indeed die, but they could also reform, and that could start the life cycle again. There is one caveat I want to offer about the iron law of oligarchy. If your faction is very distributed and lacks structure, then it can delay, perhaps indefinitely, the iron law. Think again of the Linux open source community. Because of their flat structure and lack of management per se, they are very resistant to the iron law. Or consider the Mondragon Corporation, founded in the 50s and still a worker-owned federation of cooperatives in the Basque region of Spain. They have professional management, but it is elected internally, has a strict pay gap, and the companies are still worker-owned, even 50 years after their founding. So, sufficient governance and ideology can combat the iron law as well. So we now have our full life cycle. It starts with founding. There is a gap in society that the faction steps into. Many factions die in this step, as there are many that try and fill this gap, and that creates quite a lot of competition to fill that gap. The ESA model helps us here to understand both the gap and the energy that exists that factions use in order to survive. Our next step in the life cycle is rising. Our faction has beaten off most of its main rivals and is fairly well established. There is still competition in the niche, but the faction is definitely on the move up. A faction might die in this phase, especially if one or two factions made it out of the brutal founding period, and they are the last few standing, battling each other for ascendancy. The ESA and the competitive exclusion principle applies here, with maybe hints of the iron law coming into the picture. Then we have the ascendant phase. During this period, the faction is ascendant, it is dominant. It's either the last man standing or all of its rivals are tied up in a union with a faction. It potentially has the power to challenge even governments, and it can move the whole culture. And here is where the iron law starts interfering and the oligarchy really starts forming. And that leads us into the stagnation and decline period. The faction becomes complacent, stuck in the mud, no longer innovative, and basically it's just trying to hang on to its status or its leader status. Younger challenges abound around the faction, and it is at real risk of dying if it does not reform. And if it does reform, what happens is that the faction changes in some fundamental way and comes back to life to once again fill a gap in the culture, and the life cycle starts again with it competing, albeit at an advantage, with other factions trying to fill a gap in society. That's the life cycle model. Let me know in the comments what you think. But models are all very well and good, I hear you say. Can we honestly say that this applies to factions in the real world and fantasy? Let's talk examples. We'll look at 4 case studies, from a galaxy far, far away to the blood-stained history of the Crusades, to see how these laws of world building actually play out. Let's start with fantasy and the stagnant hegemon. The Jedi of, I think that word is hegemon. Anyway, let me know in the comments. The stagnant hegemon? The stagnant hegemon. English isn't my first language, in case you didn't know that. Anyway, the Jedi of the Star Wars prequel era are the ultimate example of the iron law of oligarchy and ascendancy turned sour. When the prequels start, the Jedi are the last man standing after they beat the Sith. The Jedi were the only faction in the whole of the galaxy filling the niche of Force user. Everyone else had either been beaten or absorbed into their order. And that led very smoothly into decay as they became an ivory tower institution. Their objective shifted from following the will of the Force to preserving the Republic's bureaucracy. And that shift blinded them to the return of the Sith and the rise of Palpatine. While you could argue that the Jedi themselves were fairly selfless people, the simple truth is they had become completely tied up in maintaining the status quo, which also propped up the prestige and status of their own organization. And that's an important lesson. It's not always so simple as the oligarchs are evil. Sometimes the oligarchs are good people, but the faction has still completely stagnated away from its founding principles and towards status, just not always their own personal status. Next, let's talk about an example that illustrates the dangerous relic. If you want to see a faction in the stagnation decline phase, we only have to look at the Ottoman Janissaries. As a faction, they have a strange founding phase in that the members of the Janissaries didn't choose to found the organization. The Janissaries began as an elite corps made up through the Devstrom system of child levy enslavement. And under the system, Christian boys, mostly from the Balkans, were taken, levied, and subjected to forced circumcision and forced conversion to Islam, and they were incorporated into the Ottoman army. They became famed for internal cohesion cemented by strict discipline and order. Unlike typical slaves, they were paid regular salaries, but they were also forbidden to marry before the age of 40 or to engage in any trade, and so their complete loyalty was to the Ottoman Sultan. Seriously, they're like a study in high-cost initiation. These boys lost their cultures and parts of their anatomies and their religion, and so they clove to the identity which gave all of those high-cost events purpose. Their identity as Janissaries. Success is a biatch. By the 17th century, due to a dramatic increase in the size of the Ottoman standing armies, the Janissaries' strict recruitment policy was relaxed, and rich folk bought their way into the unit in order to benefit from the status of being part of such an elite organization. Janissaries became so powerful that they started acting as a shadow government, and they used their power to block innovation. When the sultans tried to modernize the army, the Janissaries staged coups to protect their perks. They blocked the adoption of modern rifles and European-style mass armies to protect their own standing, leading to the atrophy of the Ottoman Empire's military effectiveness. Eventually, they were an extremely hated part of the Ottoman Empire and went the way of the dodo when the empire fell. The Janissaries, in their stagnant phase, make for a very interesting example of a villain. Stagnant factions are often the absolutely best villain, despite their ossified state, because they will do almost anything to retain their power, including crippling their own society. As long as their power survives for a few more years or months or even weeks, they don't care what harm they do to their parent culture. For our third example, let's look at the death of the middle ground. The American Whig Party, a political party that existed from the 1830s to the 1850s, are a perfect study of density dependence and failing the rising phase of faction formation. There was a gap in the political parties for a party that opposed presidential power, and the Whigs rose to fill it. They were hostile towards manifest destiny and territorial expansion. They advocated for modernization, meritocracy, the rule of law, protections against majority rule, and vigilance against executive tyranny. They favored an economic program known as the American System, which called for a protective tariff, federal subsidies for the construction of infrastructure, and support for a national bank. Okay, so why didn't they make it out of the nursery? Well, they tried to occupy a middle ground niche on the issue of slavery. as a bisectional party, the Whigs had members in both the North and South, forcing them to keep slavery off the national agenda in order to maintain unity. This refusal to take a firm stance on the era's most pressing issue increasingly lowered the energy in the North as the abolition movement's energy spiked upward. This opened the Whigs to attack from especially the upstart Republican Party. The Northern Whigs flocked to this new, focused anti-slavery organization, leaving the Whig Party to fade into obscurity and eventually dissolve. The Republicans of the era had higher energy and clearer purpose, and the Whigs basically evaporated because they lost their niche. This is a great example of how something outside of the faction's core purpose and ideology can still kill them. The Whigs had a niche, but because the abolition movement took up all the air, and they needed to stay out of that fight because of their bisectional nature, their niche got completely squeezed shut. Their failure to adapt to the environment killed them. For our last example, let's talk about when stability turns lethal. For this one, we'll look at the Templars to see how the ESA model can kill a faction, even at its peak. The founding of the Knights Templar in 1119 is a classic illustration of a faction filling a functional gap. Following the First Crusade, the Crusader states lacked a dedicated military force to protect pilgrims travelling to the Holy Land. A small group of French knights, led by Hugh de Paynes, stepped into the security vacuum, initially operating as a volunteer escort service before obtaining official religious military status. But once they had it, they became pretty ascendant. By the mid-12th century, the Knights Templar had evolved from a ragtag group of vigilantes into a major international organization with a professional bureaucracy. They were granted extraordinary papal privileges, including exemption from taxes and the right to keep the spoils of war. This allowed them to establish a state within a state, independent of any European king, and they became the primary bankers for monarchs and pilgrims, inventing early forms of international banking and managing a vast economic infrastructure that supported thousands of horses and knights. They were basically on top of the world. But despite their vast power, they were not, in fact, immune from environmental shifts. The stability of their environment shattered when King Philip IV of France was broke and jealous of the Templars' power. Using the state's legal stability as a weapon, Philip moved against the Templars. Instead of competing with them in their niche or sponsoring someone else to compete with them, he approached them sideways and arrested them for heresy, the French Templars anyway. Then he leaned hard on Pope Clement to have the rest of the order declared heretic, and that allowed the kings of Europe to seize the Templar wealth, which they were, of course, very happy to do. The Templars hadn't actually started stagnating. Sure, they were hierarchical, but they were still in their strongly ascendant phase. But no matter how powerful a faction is, they are always subject to the stability of the surrounding political system. If the climate changes, even the biggest giants can fall in a single night. And speaking of the church, it occurs to me that there's one example I haven't shown, the Reform example. The Catholic Church in the 16th century represents one of the most successful historical reforms of a faction, if you'll excuse the Reformation pun. Faced with the existential threat of the Protestant Reformation, the Church convened the Council of Trent from 1545 to 1563. It's a long-ass council if you ask me. Anyway, this council was a turning point, passing dogma and disciplinary reforms that addressed the ignorance and corruption that had led to the decline of church membership. The church implemented several positive reforms. Namely, they required every diocese to establish a seminary for the purpose of training priests. They created strict rules requiring bishops to reside in their dioceses rather than living in luxury elsewhere. And they encouraged the formation of the Jesuit order in 1540, which focused on missionary work and Catholic education to regain lost territories in Europe and win converts in the New World. This startled giant effort of rejuvenation and reorganization gave the church an altogether new appearance within 30 years, allowing it to stop the expansion of Protestantism and even reclaim parts of Germany. And heck, they're still a viable organization today. So, reform is 100% possible, but it does require someone to actually see what's happening and take action to give the faction a new lease on life. And sometimes those actions are unpopular. Not everyone supported the Council of Trent. When you're building your faction, don't just think about the name, the symbols, the ranks, the tiers, even the ideology. Also think about the faction's history. Where are they in their life cycle? Have they been through reforms? How did those reforms change them? Building your faction through the life cycle model will not only help you build their lore, it will integrate them into your cities and your cultures and will create a lived-in feel that makes your readers or players believe that the faction is alive, even when they're not actively part of the story. And that's my story of the life of city factions. But this is only scratching at the surface of the kind of factions that can exist in a city. Next time, we're going to start our exploration with specific city factions, like guilds, criminal organizations, and those ever-present magic circles. So make sure you're subscribed for those. A huge thank you to my channel members who make this possible, especially to the members of the Build It in Stone level, Ellie B, A. Walyard, Epic, Jeff Hicks, Laura Bones 79, Necromancer JM, Neil Buckley, Katie Kofi Mug, and Tony Lamanna, as well as the members of the Build It in Wood level, Husio, Geraine Clark, Patricio, Ignacio Roscovan, Moxane, Jack, Mew 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 Mew, Nicholas Aman, Bare Necessities, Carrie, Ayashami Maru, and Tiffany Felix. Your help makes this podcast possible, and I wouldn't be able to do it without you. I will see you soon for another episode of Worldbuilding Blueprints. Remember, build what you need when you need it.